The statistics are stunning. Black infants are more than twice as likely to die than white infants, a racial disparity that's wider today than in 1850.
What if black life in America is under attack before it even begins? Not by mistake, not by coincidence, but by design through silent policies, neglected hospitals, and calculated indifference. For generations, black families have whispered a painful truth: that something deeper, more organized, is working to erase their future before it takes its first breath. The evidence is now impossible to ignore. Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth. Black infants die at twice the rate of white ones. Clinics once sterilized young black girls without consent. Activists were assassinated in their sleep beside their pregnant partners. Meanwhile, government agencies, from the FBI to public health departments, stood not as protectors, but as quiet participants in a system built to contain black birth. This isn't just history, it's policy, it's the present, and it's ongoing. And in today's video, we are about to get into the chilling details of how black lives are being erased before birth. Let's get started. Something is wrong. Deeply, historically, institutionally wrong. Across the United States, a sinister pattern is beginning to surface, one that's impossible to attribute to chance or coincidence. Black women are dying during childbirth at rates more alarming than in many developing nations. Black infants are being lost in numbers that remain constant despite decades of medical advancement. Young black girls, some in public schools, have been robbed of their ability to reproduce before they even understood what reproduction was. And in government documents once buried and sealed, we now find language, cold, strategic, and deliberate, that casts the black womb not as sacred, but as something to be managed, controlled, or stopped. It would be easy to call these outcomes tragic, but that would be dishonest. What's unfolding is not a series of tragic events. It is an architecture of death. Too organized to be incidental, too consistent to be natural. From the hospital to the prison, from the welfare office to the medical clinic, black life is under siege long before it takes its first breath. The destruction of black babies is not an idea pulled from paranoia. It is a reality grounded in statistics, court records, and documented federal strategies. And it's happening right now. The breaking news is not a single event. It's in the realization that the entire timeline of black life, from conception to early childhood, has been surrounded by systems built to suffocate it. When we speak of police shootings, prison sentences, and poverty, we are speaking of outcomes. But what about origins? What about the systems that ensure some black children never make it to birth? That some black mothers never survive delivery? That entire generation of black children is planned out of existence, not by accident, but by policies written decades ago and enforced quietly ever since. This is not about individual racism or personal prejudice. It is about institutional programming, about how bureaucracies view the black body as a liability, the black family as a threat, and black reproduction as something to be quietly controlled. These are not mere echoes of slavery or segregation. They are active, evolving strategies. You'll find no modern policy labeled Black Birth Reduction Act. You won't see an official FBI file named Terminate Black Infants. That's not how systemic violence works. It wears the face of benevolence. It hides behind the language of budget cuts, medical necessity, public health, and national security. It speaks through the calm tone of demographic management and the clinical voice of cost efficiency. And yet, behind every sterilized girl, behind every ignored mother in an emergency room, behind every dismissed infant death, there is a whisper. This life was never meant to grow. Ask the woman in Georgia who begged her nurse for help, only to be told she was exaggerating her pain and died. Ask the family of a 14-year-old girl in Mississippi who went in for a checkup and was left unable to ever have children. Ask the mother in Brooklyn who had her baby die in a hospital crib while she sat in the next room, unaware that her child had stopped breathing hours earlier. These are not stories, they are warnings, and they are multiplying. The broader public may not yet grasp the scale of what's happening, but within black communities, the alarm has been ringing for generations. The rumors that once filled barbershops and kitchens about birth control laced with poison, about clinics sterilizing girls behind closed doors, about government programs that wanted to keep the black population small, those rumors now stand alongside case law, medical journals, and federal investigations. They no longer sound paranoid. They sound prophetic. What makes this realization so terrifying is not just that these things happened, but that they happened under the guise of normality. The schools sterilized girls during routine health exams. The hospitals told mothers their pain was normal. The FBI surveilled parents who simply fed breakfast to their children. The state masked its violence in formality, and as a result, its victims often didn't know they were under attack until it was too late. We are now at a point where the dots are too many to ignore. Surveillance of black communities, obstruction of community health initiatives, targeting of pregnant activists, disproportionate black infant mortality, medical negligence that borders on indifference. This isn't a cracked mirror. This is a full picture, one that shows a government not failing its black citizens, but quietly choosing which of them should live. The next step is understanding how this web was built, because there was a beginning, there was a blueprint, a set of internal decisions that made black empowerment synonymous with danger and black birth a risk to national order. It wasn't accidental. It had a name. It had leaders. It had files, field agents, and funeral results, and its fingerprints are still fresh. This story begins in the mid-20th century, but its legacy touches every black child born today. Short for Counterintelligence Program, COINTELPRO was launched by the FBI in 1956 and became the most brazen, unconstitutional domestic operation in the Bureau's history. Publicly, it was marketed as a national defense initiative designed to protect the U.S. from communist subversion and insurgent threats. Privately, it became a full-spectrum offensive against black resistance. But what many overlook is that COINTELPRO was never just about undermining existing black leaders. It was about eliminating the future of black resistance at the root. And in that equation, black babies were not sacred. They were strategic targets. The FBI under J. Edgar Hoover wasn't merely afraid of radicals or revolutionaries. It was afraid of what they might create: legacy, lineage, movements that could span generations. It feared the child of a Malcolm, the next generation inspired by a Huey or a Fannie Lou. Black pregnancy became a battlefield, and so COINTELPRO's operations didn't just aim to destroy bodies. They aimed to sterilize dreams, rupture the continuity of black families, and induce fear so deep it would echo down the bloodline. What few Americans realize is that COINTELPRO actively sought to destabilize not only individuals, but the institutions of family and community. The program's tactics weren't limited to public smear campaigns or illegal wiretaps. The FBI sent anonymous letters to spouses suggesting infidelity, aimed at destroying marriages. They planted informants in community centers, churches, and schools, turning trusted spaces into sites of suspicion. They followed pregnant women home from organizing meetings. They tapped phones to monitor which activists were expecting children. They even documented the names of children attending community-run programs. In doing so, they mapped not just political networks, but generational networks. A movement that could feed its children, educate its children, and protect its children posed the greatest threat of all, because it meant that the resistance was not temporary. It was inheritable. The FBI knew this. That's why their agents took notes not only on speeches and protests, but on birth announcements, baby showers, and community clinics. That's why they didn't just raid safe houses. They raided community breakfast sites and daycares. Their logic was as cold as it was calculated. If you kill a movement's leaders, they can be replaced. But if you fracture the family, if you kill hope in the cradle, there is no one left to resist. Nowhere was this more evident than in the Bureau's reaction to black-led programs that nurtured children. The FBI understood that giving a black child food, safety, and a sense of power was tantamount to arming them. And so, Under COINTELPRO, even such nurturing acts were viewed as forms of radicalism requiring suppression. Every child fed, educated, or healed became a potential revolutionary in the making, and thus a threat to be neutralized. But the program's ambitions extended even further into the psychological. Mothers were watched, fathers were framed, children were manipulated. The very idea of raising a black child without fear, without state interference, was systematically dismantled. And when a child did manage to grow up and dream, COINTELPRO was already waiting, files in hand. What's more haunting is how COINTELPRO created a template for future state action, embedding within federal culture a suspicion of black family growth as inherently subversive. It trained generations of law enforcement to see black assembly as criminal, black empowerment as insurgent, and black birth as the first step toward rebellion. Even after COINTELPRO was officially disbanded in 1971, the logic that drove it remained embedded in federal muscle memory. Its documents were archived, its methods repackaged under new terms, and its operatives promoted instead of prosecuted. And that logic, that black continuity, is a danger to be policed, never left. If we understand COINTELPRO not just as a surveillance program, but as a generational warfare doctrine, everything else begins to make sense. The silence around black maternal deaths, the normalization of infant mortality in black communities, the passive sterilization of young girls in public health programs, all of it points back to a single operating principle: eliminate the seed before it becomes a tree. And COINTELPRO was the gardener of that destruction. In the decades following the official end of COINTELPRO, a far less visible campaign was already well underway, one conducted not in federal offices, but in community hospitals, public health centers, and social welfare offices. It was a quiet war, waged with forms, consent waivers, and sterilization equipment. This was eugenics in practice, not the overt Nazi science Americans claimed to abhor, but its bureaucratic cousin, sanitized and normalized under the guise of public health, and it was devastatingly effective. Black girls as young as 12 were led into operating rooms under the promise of routine checkups or birth control procedures. In truth, many were being sterilized without understanding, without consent, and often without their family's knowledge. It wasn't happening in secret government labs. It was happening in places with signs that said Department of Health and Human Services or Maternal and Child Wellness Clinic. The Ralph V. Weinberger case in 1973 didn't just expose a single incident, it ripped open the curtain on a national epidemic. In Montgomery, Alabama, sisters Minnie Lee and Mary Alice Ralph were sterilized at the ages of 12 and 14 by a federally funded clinic. Their mother, who couldn't read, unknowingly signed a form she believed was for birth control injections. When the truth came out, it wasn't just shocking, it was systemic. Investigators found that tens of thousands of women, mostly black, indigenous, and poor, had been sterilized through government-sponsored programs. Some estimates suggest that over 100,000 women were sterilized every year at the height of this campaign. This was not isolated malpractice. It was a structured policy. Government welfare programs frequently tied access to benefits like food stamps or medical care to compliance with family planning mandates. Black women receiving public assistance were routinely pressured, sometimes under threat of losing support, to accept procedures they didn't want or understand. In some cases, girls were told that if they didn't agree to sterilization, their families might lose housing vouchers or social security payments. The coercion was cold, calculated, and wrapped in administrative language. State governments were complicit. North Carolina, for example, ran one of the most aggressive sterilization programs in the country. Between 1929 and 1974, nearly 7,600 people were sterilized under the state's eugenics laws. While the program was initially marketed as a way to address mental deficiency, its real target became increasingly clear. By the 1960s, over 60% of the victims were black women, even though they made up less than than a quarter of the population. The justification: these women were unfit to raise children, often simply because they were poor or unmarried. What's more haunting is how common these justifications became. In Mississippi, medical staff referred to these procedures as the Mississippi appendectomy, a chilling euphemism for the sterilization of black women during unrelated surgeries without their consent. It was spoken casually, as if sterilizing a young black girl was simply another item on the daily checklist. And all of this was paid for with federal dollars. Programs like Medicaid funded sterilizations through Title X family planning initiatives, creating a pipeline in which the government directly subsidized the erasure of black fertility. These were not rogue actors. These were doctors, nurses, and policymakers working in concert under a false banner of care. At the same time, black voices calling out this abuse were often labeled hysterical or conspiratorial, but it wasn't paranoia, it was happening. What's worse, many of these procedures were performed in clinics specifically built in black neighborhoods where trust in the medical system was already fragile from generations of abuse. In places where people hoped for prenatal care and family support, they received sterilization instead. This created a legacy of reproductive trauma that still ripples through black communities today. It is not merely the loss of potential life, it is the loss of autonomy, of lineage, of trust. The trauma is passed down, not genetically, but through silence, fear, and absence. Grandmothers who never became great-grandmothers, daughters who were never allowed to be mothers, and it raises a difficult, devastating question. What does it mean for a people when their ability to reproduce is treated as a threat to national order? This was not just physical sterilization, it was generational sabotage, as intimate and as irreversible as any act of war. But the state's targeting didn't end with the womb. Here's a quick reminder. Please like, share, and subscribe to Black Culture Unlocked for powerful black news, real stories of our heroes and leaders, and the rich culture and history the world tried to forget. By the early 1970s, the physical sterilizations were already cutting into generations of black families, quietly sanctioned by the state. But what followed was far more insidious, because the war on black birth was no longer waged only in clinics or operating rooms. It had evolved into narrative warfare, carried out in conference halls, media rooms, presidential briefings, and public policy debates. It was no longer just about what was done to the black body. It was about what was said about the black womb. And this is where a new phrase, once whispered in private, but soon shouted in protest, entered the national conversation with a thundering urgency: Black genocide. This phrase did not originate from conspiracy theorists or fringe radicals. It came from ministers, poets, community leaders, and mothers. It came from people who had seen too much to believe in coincidence. By the time the phrase began appearing on flyers, protest banners, and in testimony before Congress, it had become a moral indictment of the state itself. Black genocide was not a claim made lightly. It was a response to real, quantifiable harm. To many in the black community, the sudden flood of birth control clinics in inner-city neighborhoods, the pressure on poor black women to accept long-term contraceptives, and the silence of the federal government on decades of reproductive abuse all pointed to a singular conclusion. The state didn't merely neglect black life, it wanted less of it. One of the earliest and most powerful articulations of this fear came in 1970 during the National Black Power Conference in Philadelphia. There, a resolution was passed declaring that government-sponsored birth control efforts represented nothing less than black genocide. The statement didn't argue against the idea of reproductive autonomy. It argued against the context in which that autonomy was being manipulated. When birth control becomes more accessible than prenatal care, when abortion clinics outnumber in black neighborhoods, when the same government that sterilized teenage girls now hands out free contraception without any discussion of alternatives, choice choice becomes an illusion. This wasn't theoretical. It was deeply personal. People like civil rights activist and comedian Dick Gregory gave voice to the raw skepticism pulsing through Black America. He once quipped with biting truth, "In slavery, we were forced to have babies. Now that we're free, they're begging us to stop." His words landed like a hammer. The very country that once commodified Black birth now wants to contain it. And for many, that reversal revealed the game for what it truly was: control, not care. This perspective became more urgent as population control rhetoric exploded in the 1970s. Politicians, academics, and think tanks warned of an urban explosion, a euphemism for the growing Black and brown populations in American cities. Books like The Population Bomb by Paul Ehrlich stoked public fear about overpopulation and social decay, while quietly suggesting that high birth rates among the poor, especially Black Americans, were a national threat. President Nixon himself, in private conversations later released on White House tapes, expressed enthusiasm for birth control as a way to lower crime. The implication was not subtle. Crime, in his coded language, meant urban, urban meant Black, and birth control, in this calculus, became a tool of racial containment. At the same time, federal funding for population control programs soared. Title X, the only federal grant program dedicated solely to family planning, was signed into law in 1970. On its surface, it aimed to give low-income women access to contraception and reproductive health care. But critics quickly noticed how disproportionately these programs were deployed in Black and Latino neighborhoods, often without adequate oversight or community input. In some cities, family planning centers outnumbered pediatric clinics 3-to-1. This imbalance became harder to defend. Community leaders began asking, why is the state so eager to help us not have children, but so reluctant to help us raise the ones we do? To activists like Queen Mother Moore, Kwame Ture Stokely Carmichael, and groups like the Nation of Islam, it wasn't just about birth control, it was about survival. They began framing these efforts as an existential threat designed to permanently weaken Black political power by stunting population growth. If the FBI feared the rise of a Black Messiah, as COINTELPRO had declared, then the broader state feared the rise of a Black generation. The reaction was not uniform. Black feminist thinkers like Shirley Chisholm and Loretta Ross challenged the framing of birth control as genocide, arguing that reproductive justice meant access to all options, including the right to limit pregnancies. But even they acknowledged the brutal truth. Black women had never been given a fair chance to make those choices freely. What existed instead was coercion disguised as care, and policy masquerading as empowerment. By the late 1970s, the term Black genocide had taken root, not as a slogan, but as a collective memory. It became the lens through which medical racism, government neglect, and state policy were seen as part of a unified structure, one that worked not merely to punish Black people, but to prevent their future altogether. And still, the damage continued, not just in bodies, but in trust. Generations of Black families began to pass down stories, warnings, and a deep ancestral suspicion of white coats and state programs. Even where policies were well-intentioned, they arrived with blood on their hands. But what happens when genocide doesn't come in the form of force, but in the form of silence? When the state no longer sterilizes, but simply lets mothers die? When does the system stop using scalpels and start using indifference? That is where the story turns next, into the modern medical system, where the Black death continues not through action, but through apathy. Because genocide has many faces, and one of them wears a stethoscope. It moves through hallways lined with monitors and policies, not guns and laws, but the effect is devastatingly familiar. Black women continue to face labor and delivery with the quiet knowledge that they are 3 times more likely to die from childbirth complications than white women in the same hospitals. And too often, when they cry out, no one listens until it's too late. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention (CDC), over 80% of maternal deaths in the United States are preventable. Yet the data has not moved. The number has not shrunk. Instead, Black women remain at the highest risk, and the justifications for this gap have grown ever more absurd. Providers cite stress, lifestyle, late prenatal care, everything but the most obvious explanation that the system is indifferent to Black pain. Black maternal mortality is not just a statistic, it is a signal. It tells us exactly who this country is willing to save and who it's willing to let go. And this apathy is not accidental, it is institutional. It begins the moment a Black woman enters the hospital and is asked to fill out forms by someone who doesn't look her in the eye. It continues when her concerns about abnormal symptoms are brushed off as anxiety or hormonal mood swings. It escalates when her reports of pain during labor are met with smaller doses of medication, none at all, because medical myths about Black bodies being more resilient persist even in the era of artificial intelligence and robotic surgery. This isn't ancient history. This is now. In 2019, elite athlete and tennis legend Serena Williams nearly died after giving birth because nurses dismissed her self-reported symptoms of a pulmonary embolism. Only after she demanded a CT scan and heparin treatment did they listen, barely in time. If one of the most powerful, wealthy, and globally recognized Black women could barely get doctors to take her seriously, what chance does a working-class mother in Alabama, Detroit, or New Orleans have? And what of the babies? Black infants in the United States die at more than double the rate of white infants. The causes are often labeled as prematurity, low birth weight, or sudden infant death syndrome (SIDS). But those are effects, not causes. The real reasons are more uncomfortable. Inadequate prenatal care, environmental stress, housing insecurity, racial discrimination, and chronic exposure to medical neglect. In a groundbreaking 2020 study, researchers found that when Black newborns were cared for by Black physicians, their mortality rate was cut in half. In other words, the identity and bias of the healthcare provider can determine whether a Black baby lives or dies. That should be a national emergency. Instead, it was treated as an interesting footnote in the academic world. These are not flukes. These are patterns. They are outcomes created by systems where implicit bias is baked into everything from diagnosis to treatment plans. They are the result of a medical industry that has never fully confronted its role in the historic abuse of Black bodies, from slavery-era gynecological experiments to the Tuskegee syphilis study to the modern underfunding of Black majority hospitals. And the silence from policymakers is deafening. Even when the issue is acknowledged, it is often stripped of urgency. Congressional proposals like the Momnibus Act, intended to reduce Black maternal mortality, sit stalled or underfunded. Hospitals promise bias training, as if a 2-hour workshop could erase centuries of medical racism. Meanwhile, Black mothers continue to whisper warnings to each other. Advocate for yourself. Don't go to that hospital, and bring someone with you who won't let them ignore you. These are survival tactics in a system that should be designed for safety, but has instead become a place of danger. The result is a quiet epidemic. It doesn't make headlines like shootings. It doesn't trend on social media like police brutality. But it kills, consistently, predictably, unapologetically. Black women walk into hospitals to give life and come out in body bags. Babies are born into a world that already treats them as expendable. Their first breaths shadowed by statistics that say they might not see their first birthday. This is what reproductive violence looks like in the modern age. It's not about force anymore. It's about neglect that kills just as effectively as action ever did. It's about institutions that refuse to be accountable, even as Black bodies pile up on their watch. It's about grief that becomes normalized in a community that deserves celebration, not funerals when new life arrives. And still, Still, the state watches, it sees the data, it funds studies, it reads the headlines, and it does not move. This is not a passive failure, it is an active permission. A permission slip was handed out by every hospital board that refuses reform, every legislator who won't fund equitable care, and every medical school that trains new doctors without confronting their inherited bias. The tools have changed. The outcome has not. After generations of bodily control, reproductive violation, and institutional neglect, it would seem logical to assume that the state had exhausted its tools of suppression. But systems designed for domination are rarely dismantled. They are rebranded, recoded, and repackaged for modern sensibilities. In this evolution, one truth remains constant. The survival of Black life continues to be treated as a national threat. In the 21st century, the battlefield has expanded, no longer limited to hospital wards or government-funded clinics. The state's gaze has shifted toward another arena: the streets, the protests, the hashtags, and the algorithms. And once again, it is Black communities that remain at the center of this intensified scrutiny, not because they are dangerous, but because they refuse to disappear. In the aftermath of uprisings in Ferguson, Baltimore, and Minneapolis, as Black Americans organized under the banner of resistance, the government responded in an eerily familiar way. Leaked FBI documents revealed the birth of a new internal classification: Black identity insurgents. On paper, it was a term meant to identify individuals engaged in racially motivated violence. In practice, it was a blank check to monitor, infiltrate, and silence Black movements that dared to call for justice. This label was not born in a vacuum. It was the spiritual successor to COINTELPRO, that ghost of an operation that had once declared the rise of a Black Messiah a national security threat. Many of the same surveillance tools used to track civil rights leaders in the 1960s, wiretapping, infiltration, strategic disinformation, were redeployed under this new terminology. Only now, with the aid of 21st century technology, social media monitoring, AI-assisted data tracking, and digital blacklists. Under the Black identity insurgent label, individuals who had committed no crime were placed under federal observation for engaging in constitutionally protected activities. Organizing protests, speaking out against police violence, or posting political commentary online was enough to land activists on watch lists. In 2019, civil liberties groups obtained documents showing that the FBI devoted significant counterinsurgency resources to tracking Black activists, even as it publicly claimed the category no longer existed, but the logic behind it never died. Where COINTELPRO once aimed to disrupt, discredit, and neutralize Black leaders, the modern surveillance state seeks to contain Black resistance before it gathers strength. The tools have changed, but the objectives have not. Facial recognition systems are disproportionately deployed in Black neighborhoods. Predictive policing algorithms use biased crime data to reinforce patrol patterns in areas already over-policed. Social media posts that criticize government actions are flagged and cataloged, often without the user's knowledge. Even Black-led mutual aid networks, those offering free food, healthcare, or bail support, have come under suspicion. As in the 1970s, when the state targeted Black Panthers for feeding children, today's systems view grassroots care as a precursor to radicalism. The message is clear: when Black people organize for their survival, the state assumes it must be plotting something dangerous. The tragedy is not just the intrusion of this surveillance, it's the silence around it. Few mainstream discussions center on the fact that young Black organizers are routinely watched, followed, or infiltrated. Few journalists investigate why protests against police brutality draw the attention of counterinsurgency units, while white supremacist networks have been allowed to flourish online for years. The imbalance is not accidental, it is structural, because the state still prioritizes preserving its power over preserving Black lives. This hyper-surveillance bleeds into daily life in ways often invisible to outsiders. A mother attending a school board meeting about curriculum is flagged for radical rhetoric. A father who posts about his child's wrongful arrest is placed on a suspicious activity list. Even grieving families seeking justice for murdered loved ones are sometimes quietly monitored to assess their potential for incitement. There is a reason for this deep, continuous gaze. To monitor someone is to strip them of privacy, but also of dignity. It is a constant reminder that their freedom is conditional, that their movements are not theirs alone, that they are being watched, not for their safety, but for their suppression. And when that surveillance is turned inward, against parents, caregivers, and children, it sends a message louder than any policy ever could. Your family is a threat. In this way, the state manages to replicate the emotional trauma of earlier eras without the headlines. It doesn't need to sterilize your daughter. It just needs her to grow up knowing that if she speaks out, her name goes in a file. It doesn't need to kill your son. It just needs to monitor him long enough to break his sense of safety. And yet, the targets of this surveillance do not go quietly. From Oakland to Atlanta, from Chicago to Tulsa, Black organizers have begun building encrypted communication networks, community defense coalitions, and healing circles. They are not hiding, they are adapting. Because they know the truth, the state fears Black unity more than it fears any weapon. And unity begins in the home, in the community, in the womb. That's why the state has always tried to sever those bonds, through sterilization, through neglect, through criminalization, and now through constant surveillance. The war on Black life has moved into the cloud, into data servers, into drone footage. But its logic is old, its roots are deep. Do you think it is possible to fight this war? Will talking about it make things easy? Let us know in the comments section. Did you know about it? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it, because here we tell the stories no one else will. From ancient African civilizations to modern Black excellence, we reveal the truth, the power, and the legacy they tried to erase. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.